Okay, so this is my presentation, and I'll sit, and some of it is, like I said, I've already kind of spoiled the plot in the interview, so I'll go over everything, and then we can have more time for questions if you want. Is that okay?
That sounds good.
Okay. All right, if I want to run this on my own computer, switch. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my teaching history, which I've already shared a little bit about, the theory that informs my research, and then in turn my teaching, because I think that, especially in a college of education or in the field of education, teaching and research should be kind of hard to separate. My current research agenda, and then how my teaching and research has influenced my teacher preparation, or how I think about teaching teachers to be in classrooms, and then my ideas for funding and future research. So like I said, a lot of this I've kind of already touched on, so I'll go through it quickly, and then if you have further questions, we can get to that. So my personal history, as you already know, I'm from a tiny town in Loudon, Iowa. I put a star on Iowa because so many people will be like, oh yeah, Idaho, like the potatoes, or inevitably someone will come up to me later in the day and say like, oh, you know, I used to live in Ohio. No, Iowa. So it's right there with the red star. That's the Kedley farm. And the Irish immigrants came after the potato famine, and me in a cornfield, and me when I was a little kid. So I went to University of Northern Iowa, which is the state normal school, the teaching college, and we had a lab school, and it was really like lots of practical experiences. So even early on, when I was a sophomore, I remember being thrown in a class of like 7th graders, and the teacher being, try anything, you can try anything. So it was a really great experience, and the kids were totally used to being tried anything on, so they were good sports about it. After I graduated from the University of Northern Iowa, my resume was online, and I moved to Yuma, Arizona, which I put the red star on it. And that's where I was for 5 years. I taught mostly AP English 9, like honors English 9, but then I coached cross-country basketball and track, and did lots of different things. I got my master's degree there from Northern Arizona University. There was a campus in Yuma. And also I taught at the community college there for ELL students. Then I moved to Honduras for 3 years. I put the star also there. A lot of people will say, oh, is that a state in Mexico? Or what part of Mexico is that from? No. And it's actually, if you look at the map, I always say that, moving from Iowa to Arizona is not that much further than Iowa to Honduras. So the flight to, for example, Atlanta, and then Atlanta to Honduras is only, an hour and a half. So it's not actually geographically that far away. While there, the top picture is me with my 8th graders at the international school. Again, those students were the elite of the country. They had condos in Miami, and they would fly to Italy for the weekend for their prom dresses. And we had a smartboard in my classroom before I knew what a smartboard was, like in 2006, if you can imagine. And then I've gone back since 2009. I've gone back at least twice a year, usually for a month or two each time. And then I did my dissertation research there for 8 months in 2015. While I was there, I taught, I played on a basketball team, and I was in an LGBT group, and that's how I learned Spanish and kind of learned about the environment outside the international school. Then I moved back to Iowa, started graduate school. I do a lot of activism that I kind of connect to my my teaching. I've adjuncted at those schools, and then I'm in the College of Education at Iowa. So that's my teaching history. And if you'll indulge me for a little bit, because it has influenced how I think about teaching, and I do believe the personal is political and the political is personal. So my own personal history as a teacher has been influenced heavily by my own kids. So these are my 3 kids. The baby is named Malachi, he's 12. Kaiser is 17, he's a senior in high school, and then Boris is 23, he's a senior in college. The Kaiser has ADHD, dyslexia, he's got terrible grades, but of course he always scores in about the top 10% of testing when he gets tested. But he, for example, I just checked his grades the other day, he has like 3 D pluses and 2 Fs. So he's a terrible, terrible student. He's got terrible executive functioning skills, and I have learned, as a parent, how important it is for teachers to, sign his notebook to make sure he has homework and be double checking and things like that. Teachers are not often willing to do that. And I think back to my own time as, in a classroom teaching, and how willing I was to offer, multiple reminders to students, which he definitely needs. The baby is like the kid who, they're home alone this weekend. He was home alone all by himself yesterday. He's totally fine. I will get home and he will have all the forms that need to be filled out. He'll have the checks filled out. He'll have Post-it notes with arrows next to it. Sign here, Mom. Like, he's got everything under control.
How old is he? 9?
12. 12 now, yeah. So he's the type of kid that, like, if he has a 99%, he will start crying. But on the other hand, he also, like, if the thing is, read for 30 minutes a day, he sets the timer on his phone, and when the 30 minutes comes up, he could be in the middle of a sentence and he will shut the book. He's like, done. And so he's the type of student that, like, needs to be pushed. Like, he will put whatever limits like, he follows every single rule, and he won't do anything extra because he doesn't think he has to. Like, he just is doing exactly what he has. And then Boris, as I mentioned, I think last night, I adopted him when he was 15, he's 23 now, from Honduras, and you may have heard a couple years ago with the 60,000 Central American kids on the border between, they were all qualifying for special immigrant visas, and that's the visa that he qualified for as an abandoned minor. And I was appointed his guardian, and he came here when he was 15 with, like I said, huge gaps in his schooling, like years lost. He'd never read a book before. I doubt if he'd read or ever read anything like longer than a paragraph. He didn't speak a word of English. And he was in an ELL program. He enrolled at the local high school. And I realized right away, I'd been teaching ELL students, not in ELL programs, the limitations of it. So first of all, he was in ELL classes with only other ELL students, which is fine. I was really glad because, it's like the United Nations in that classroom. But he never had access to the students in the other parts of the school who were getting, a full ride to Notre Dame, one of his classmates got, and a full ride to Stanford. And they never had classes together. And because I, am a teacher, and I know how the schools and stuff work, I would go in and I say, like, sign him up for AP Spanish 4, sign him up for art, sign him up for foods or whatever, so that he's speaking English with other, native English speakers. And I realize that's a real limitation of ELL programming, is how isolated they are. And even if he was in a regular math class because of scheduling, like, they were all still in the same kind of math class together. I also realized, so like I said, Kaiser's got like D's and F's and everything, and no one has ever even suggested that he should not go to college to me. This has never even come up. At conferences, like, everybody's like, of course he's going to go to college. Like, this is just the assumption. When I would go to parent-teacher conferences with Boris, I was saying, the older Honduran child, I would say things like, I want to make sure he's got all his credits to get into college, and wherever he falls is where he falls, like, but let's prepare him. And they'd be like, oh, you might be setting your expectations too high. Like, he wasn't even getting bad grades. Kaiser's grades are, like, terrible. And that's never been suggested. And so I learned really quickly that I had to be his advocate. And then I think about immigrant families, or families who don't have strong relationships with schools or strong understandings of schools, and how that can affect, and so anyway, I don't normally, maybe necessarily think personal and professional lives are that integrated, but I do actually think, especially for women, the personal is political. And so the ways that I have had, to deal with my kids and their different issues has influenced how I think as a teacher. And Boris is, I kind of want to go back to the school counselor and be like, well, what do you know? Because he's a senior at the Catholic University in Cedar Rapids. He got a soccer scholarship, completely bilingual, and he's going to graduate this year in social work. So it's a great story, but I don't believe that I'm like the benevolent person that took care of it. I do believe that I knew how to run schools, and I think that that's a real gap in the ways that maybe, people who don't have that historical relationship with schools. I walk into school and I'm not like, I don't have any bad memories of, getting kicked out or being in trouble or anything. So I think that's unfortunate because without that, a lot of students miss opportunities. My research agenda is in 3 areas. Like I said, my dissertation, the Publicly Engaged Scholarship Project with the activist, writer, lawyer in Honduras, and then ELA classrooms and teachers. Sorry, I lost them. The theory that informs my research, transnational feminism, Mohanty. I'm not sure if anyone has heard of her, but she's one of my favorite scholars, and it really influences how I think about my research, but then also how I have now been thinking about my teaching. So I guess the main thing I'm taking from her ideas in transnational feminism is, number 1, the idea of the global and the local. So when you do research, you always have to pay attention to the global and the local. So for example, if I were to go to Honduras and do research there, maybe I'm looking at, this relationship, I come from the United States and what's going on in Honduras. Maybe I want to bring like clean water. That's my research. But I also need to look at the local. So I'm bringing clean water to a household, but then what does the neighbor think about that? Like that's often what is missing from the research is like, oh, all of the runoff from the pollution or something the neighbor lady is getting affected by. So the global and the local is not just me and the person I'm researching, it's also how is that research affecting the neighbors, the people living down the street. So that's something that I'm always thinking about in terms of when I'm in communities, when I'm teaching, what is my impact globally and locally. Critical pedagogy, and especially the idea that I think in the United States there's a lot of like, of course we know these things are wrong or they come out of power dynamics, but we're like, our hands are tied, we're not quite sure what the action should be. So the critical pedagogy part, I'm always thinking of how people should be acting out of what they know. And then sociocultural theory with Vygotsky, I obviously believe in that you learn from your community and your culture, not just from the person that you're sitting next to, like with the ZPD, but also people that you've sat next to in the past and people that those people have sat next to. There's all these different levels of learning, and I think they're important to recognize and important to think about what they bring to a classroom. So my dissertation is entitled English Language Education in Honduras, Opportunity, Adventure, or Empire. So the problems in the field, or the gaps in the research that I saw was when I'm in Honduras, or currently in Honduras, it's assumed that having English language speaking skills, but reading and writing too, will automatically lead to a better life. This is like an unquestioned narrative that is happening in society with nearly everybody. And this includes teachers, it includes North Americans, it includes Hondurans. I started, once I was living there, I started to question that a little bit. So for example, I'll just give an anecdote. This guy named Tonio, who was about 23 years old, got deported to the neighborhood where I was living, and everybody said, oh, Tonio's getting deported, he's in detention, he's getting deported next week. Oh, but Tonio's been in the United States for 15 years, he speaks perfect English, like this is going to be easy for him to find a job. He'll just go to the airport, he'll just do something in tourism, he can go to a call center, he can get a job. So he comes back, no one has seen him since he's like been little, and Tonio has tattoos on his knuckles, and he doesn't know how to use a computer. So he starts applying for jobs because he speaks English like I do. At the airport, he can't get a job because of the tattoos. At the call centers, he can't get a job because he doesn't know how to use a computer. And so it wasn't that he spoke English, right? Everybody says, as long as you speak English, but no, it's like highly mediated by, your race, your gender, your geography, where you've been living, your education level, who you know, and then, down to if you have tattoos or not. And so everybody just kind of automatically assumes like, oh, if I just fill my head up with English, or if I just fill your head up with English, you will have a better life. That's not always the case. English as a language subject, and I'm saying this because there's a lot of schools in Honduras